5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
You're listening to Relentless. This is the show for high performers who are driven and committed to being at their best. Nick Peterson and Jonathan Montgomery, co-founders of Relentless Dietetics, are your hosts.
Welcome to the Relentless Podcast. I'm Nick Peterson, hanging out today with Jonathan Montgomery.
What is up?
And the Dr. Trevor Cashy.
Hello.
As per usual, we're here to discuss getting a little bit better every day. And if you've been listening, you know by now we've been working on giving you the tools, the mental models, some advanced concepts and filters that help you make decisions and get better every day. And while we need to focus on taking these actions and making these positive improvements and changes, in order to be useful in the long run and be happy, we still have to acknowledge that there are people that matter to us and they do exist and they have feelings and stuff like that. So learning to communicate effectively with these people is ultimately going to make your journey so much smoother, less resistance, less friction, and it's going to facilitate a lot more support along the way just because they understand what's going on. And when you have this support, when you have less friction, when you have less resistance from others, you can do what we always tell you to do and really focus on keeping the main thing the main thing.
I think you're really onto something here. And for me, that key takeaway was the emphasis on the effective part of communicating effectively. One of my favorite quotes on the subject was from George Bernard Shaw. And he said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And for me, that's a pretty big problem. And it's quite often what's missing between what people feel is communication and what communication actually is. There's a radical difference between communicating with someone and just talking at them, or in actively listening to someone instead of just spending time thinking of what you want to say next or just waiting to speak. When you're interacting with others, ask yourself, are you actually interested in communication and in dialogue with purpose, exchanging ideas, or are you just concerned with being heard or always being right? Two different outcomes from those.
That's a conversation we have a lot, I think, is do you want to win this conversation? Do you want to be right? Or do you want to come up with the best solution for all parties involved? It reminds me of that story in a book called Crucial Conversations. Two girls have to go to the bathroom, right? And the dad takes them to the bathroom and there's only one. And they fight over who gets to go first because they have to go so bad. And they just go back and forth for 30, 45 minutes about who has to go worse. Obviously, in this amount of time, either one or both could have gone and been and would have been over with. So that's kind of the illustration of like the problem. Are you really trying to solve the problem? Like, hey, I have to go to the bathroom right now. Or are we going to waste 45 minutes going back and forth trying to be right? Winning an argument and finding the best solution to the problem are two very, very different things.
Right is always going to be extremely relative. And there are often a lot of times when being right doesn't necessarily lead to the best possible outcome when multiple parties are involved. Back to the story of the two girls, really, who was the winner there? You both waited 45 minutes when it would have took 30 seconds. So for me, the key thing here just lies in asking yourself a couple of questions. What do you want from this interaction? Is it just to win or is it to actually, advance?
I think Oprah actually says something similar. I don't know what made me think of this. Maybe my mother or something watched Oprah, but she says something to the effect of, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy?
Absolutely. I'll even take it old school. We'll go with the Good Riddance, an old punk rock reference. He's like, I don't care who's right. I don't want to fight, and that's the same thing, and again, circle back. What do you want from the interaction? But most importantly, I think here's what's missing from a lot of conversations, air quotes, is what do they want from the interaction? What does the person you're talking to want as well? And, focusing number 3 on how can you work together to make both of those things occur? In other words, what's the win-win here? Not what do you win and they lose, but how do you both walk away with something from the conversation? Because if you're not doing that, if you're not doing everything you can to ensure that all parties involved are getting something from the situation and everyone is coming out ahead, then again, you're not nearly as interested in communication as you are in being heard and getting your way. And that's just childish, man. Nobody wants to be in a conversation with that guy.
You make a good point about being heard, and I think Steve will probably be on the podcast in the coming times. But he said something that really stuck with me, especially in the context of being heard, is that you start with the illusion about communication is that people think it happened. And then there's sometimes isn't even an agreement if there needs to be a conversation to begin with. Sometimes a person just wants to talk and wants somebody else to listen. And I think a lot of times you can remove a lot of bit of tension by getting that out of the way ahead of time. Because sometimes you just want to talk. And sometimes thinking out loud allows you to get to the solution you need without the input of somebody else who you just need to listen to you. And sometimes like, hey, I'm just going to talk at you for a couple of minutes. Do not tell me how to run my life. I'm just going to complain. Is that okay?
Absolutely. And again, I think that comes with stating the premise of the conversation. What do I want out of this? And what do you want out of this?
Right.
What I want is to be heard. What you want is to not get yelled at. So just shut up and listen.
Yeah, if you have two people that are trying to be heard and like force their way to being heard or to being the louder party, you got to remember that force produces counterforce. You're going to have more resistance and you're going to make more enemies long term. And in Steve's case, you don't want your enemy to be your wife. But Jonathan said, what was that quote? I don't want to be right. I just don't want to fight.
Yeah, I don't care who's right. I don't want to fight. Old Russ Rankin, man, good riddance, taking it back to, circa 2000 back in the day.
One of my favorite influencers of all time is Benjamin Franklin. And he said, speak not, but what may benefit others, avoid trifling conversation, right? Same thing. Benjamin Franklin, if you read his biographies, his autobiographies, was like, what do I have to do in order to be an effective human? And he had a point in his life where he realized if I don't learn how to communicate and create these win-win situations that Jonathan was just talking about, I will never accomplish the things that I need to accomplish.
I just think it's pretty awesome that we were able to draw a parallel between Ben Franklin and Russ Rankin. Russ, if you're listening, I'm a huge fan. I know Ben Franklin's not listening, but look at that, man. Right there with one of the founders. Good for you. But, honestly, man, I think it's the worst when again, that illusion of communication that it occurring, thinking you're on the same page and realizing you're worlds apart after the fact. When you're going to communicate, it's something you got to be aware of. Something I try to stay cognizant of and put effort into improving is how to better communicate. How can I make sure that my intentions are clear, that ambiguity is removed and the message is coming through? How can I strengthen the signal and reduce the noise, so to speak? And to me, this is something it takes work. It takes digging a little bit and taking the ability to accept the fact that you just may be doing it wrong altogether. You just may not be communicating. You may be yelling or ranting. You may just be making noise. And I think for me, a big part of this is realizing that people are not and should not be expected to be clairvoyant, nor do they always have access to all the information you have stored in your head. Instead, you got to take the time and take the extra steps to paint that clear picture and formulate your thoughts in a way that truly conveys what you want to say. To me, it's huge, and it's worth the extra effort when you actually want to be able to get that point across. Whether it's determining if a conversation needs to take place or actually working together in unison to communicate through an issue.
Yeah, I think highlighting that people are not mind readers is important. A lot of times we default, even in a business setting. Like I've been there with you, Jonathan, where I go back to my office, which obviously is right next to yours, and be like, man, he should just know what I'm thinking. And we kind of default to that because I think it's a biological drive to conserve energy, right? And just have these biases and assumptions. But you just have to understand it is not fair to say, well, my wife should just trust me, or, my business partner should just know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. It's not fair and it's not productive.
Why you're doing something is pretty important. It actually reminds me of one of the I guess original episodes we did about asking the right questions. Because sometimes if you ask yourself the wrong question, you give yourself the wrong answer. So your reason for doing something is not appropriately communicated to somebody else, even though in your mind it makes sense. The classic example we used before is like, I want to lose 30 pounds. Well, no, you don't want to lose 30 pounds. You just want your knees to hurt less. So maybe if you communicated that you wanted your knees to hurt less, then the rationalizing your behavior to other people may not be so difficult for them to understand.
I know we mentioned Steve already, and if we can pull him on, and if anybody listening wants to hear more about it, just leave reviews or let us know the importance of that particular point that Trevor just made.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the mind readers thing, nobody knows what your true desire is. So it's up to you to communicate it. It's up to you to kind of dig deep and ask why a few more times, and not just tell me what you think or what you think I want to hear, but what you actually feel. But going back to something that you said, Nick, that stood out to me when it came to us, being divided by a wall and expected to know what everybody's doing, is, we all have that habit of assumptions. We all engage in that transference, or, attaching characteristics and behaviors or habits and knowledge of others, sometimes including ourselves, to other individuals by default. And you kind of touched on it, blame it on our lazy brains trying to be efficient, or whatever survival instinct is, lingering around that equates a rustle in the bushes to the need to dodge a saber-toothed tiger. But, the fact remains it's there and it's going to happen. And to me, I don't think it's necessarily a problem with the act itself, but with just blindly accepting it without question, and then subsequently expecting people to just know things simply because you do, or because someone they remind you of once did. But on the other side of the coin, and this is what I really want to touch on, is as much as we have to realize that people aren't, mind readers capable of knowing all there is to know, you also have to realize that you yourself are not one either. Much like others cannot be expected to know what you are thinking, you cannot possibly expect with any degree of certainty to know another person's thoughts and feelings without taking the time to let them express them to you while actively listening to what they have to say. And that's that two-way street.
If you're ready to get the body you desire without depriving yourself of the foods you enjoy, download your free diet playbook now at www.relentlesspodcast.com.
The most unpopular thing that we tell people, I think, is the fact that this is on them, right? Like, this is 100% on you, because context matters. Each person goes into a conversation or an interaction with a different frame and a belief system. And 99.9% of people are completely unaware that these different belief systems even exist, right? Now that you've listened to this, you're aware, and now it's on you. But the other person you're talking to is not going to understand that you have different belief systems. They're not going to understand that miscommunication happens all the time, right? So it's really on you to take responsibility to understand that I have a belief system, this person has a belief system, and developing, where can I find that point where it's a win-win, like Jonathan said earlier. Assuming the other person is not going to take the time to listen, it's really on you.
Yeah, and I think that's key, because, people are going to give those context clues if you let them. If you let someone talk for long enough, chances are you're going to hear what they're actually saying. And that's part of that active listening. Active listening, it's a skill, and it's a pretty crucial one to develop. But like any other skill, it's going to take some practice and some conscious effort. Hearing, by contrast, hearing is just a reaction, a physiological response. It occurs. You can't really avoid it. You can't really turn it off, although it's pretty safe to say you can tune it out. We've all been there and done that. But listening, truly listening, takes far more focus. It takes some patience. And again, it takes that effort. But doing so, you're going to kind of develop actual understanding, empathy, knowledge from another person, and it's going to provide time for reflection, to really listen, to deeply listen without reacting, projecting, formulate a response. It takes that active role. You need to be aware to more than just the sound. You need to be aware of the language being used, the tone, volume, what's the eye contact, the physical space, how about the posture? Pay attention to those nonverbal communications, because that's where a lot of the story is, especially from a cultural or a belief system context. The whole story behind the story, and not just the part you want to hear or the part you want to respond to. If you're sitting there in the middle of a conversation, especially, one that matters, and you're waiting to talk, you're thinking about what to say next or coming up with a contradictory statement and what comment you can make to win, then in essence, you've already lost the game when it comes to actually communicating. So take that time and listen, I think, is a big key there.
Man, I'm not very good at active listening at all, but I try and make up for it with active questioning.
I think that's an effective form. I mean, I think that's an effective form of active listening is asking the right probing questions.
If I don't understand something like 1000%, I'll just keep asking questions until it annoys to the person to either explain it in a way that I understand, or maybe them realizing they weren't thinking what they originally thinking to begin with, which actually happens quite often if you keep asking, like the why question Jonathan brings up. You ask enough questions, eventually it's going to come down to a feeling, and that feeling might actually be the solution to what they need if they're looking for any solution to begin with. Otherwise, I try and sit and listen, but it like Jonathan said, sometimes you get stuck on wanting to say something. You might not be listening to what a person's trying to say because you're trying to get a word in. But if I hear something I don't understand, my brain will I'll have my own block, and I'll just be I will have to ask a person to get them to clarify what they said, because anything after that, it just does not absorb me at all. I have this weird mental block with that.
But I think what's interesting there is you're asking questions to actually elicit more of the story, more of the truth, more of their side, more of their beliefs. And to me, I think that is an active role, because why would you allow someone to continue piling on if you're missing a crucial component? And it's funny you mentioned asking questions. It always reminds me of the deposition. I think you told that story before, where you said, I don't understand the question like 500 times or something. I was reading in a book the other day about a guy talking about his PhD mentor in college when he was doing a business program, and he would come with this concept for this business, and the guy was like, I don't understand. Every time he would explain it, day after day, I don't understand, for the entire hour of their advisor session. After a couple months of this, the guy just thought, I thought this guy was brilliant. I didn't get it. But what he did by asking that question was get him to distill it down, solve his own problems, and make him realize he didn't understand what he was trying to do. But by having to explain it to a 2-year-old, like we talk about all the time, he really was able to peel back layers and get a more thorough grasp of his concept when he wanted to communicate it to others. And of course, as the fairy tale ends, it went on to help him get like $400 billion in his first round of capital or whatever. But anyway, it's funny. It's funny the way you PhDs do things.
Just to circle back to Trevor asking questions about questions over and over. What I think it does is kind of irritating at first, because I just want him to read my mind, but it eliminates the back end resistance, because he will ask questions until there's clarity on what are we trying to accomplish, what are you saying, and that to me is an active form of listening. I appreciate that, as frustrating as it is to have to think about my own thoughts, but it eliminates any opportunity for himself to fill in those gaps later. He cannot tell himself stories and get wild because he's demanded clarity. And that's kind of what happens if you don't take time to listen and understand and figure out where this person is coming from. You leave the conversation, and even though the facts are the same, the stories you start telling yourselves, you end up on completely different pages.
That's exactly where the fixed versus growth mindset fits in. Because the fixed portion of these attributes are you filling in essentially what your assumptions in the holes, right? This person now has some attribute that cannot be changed. If there's a hole in whatever story or conversation, you fill that in with something, and what you fill it in with is going to be something fixed. So that might be something that's worth chewing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back again to why you ask questions, because you don't want to fill those holes in. Man, just don't tell yourself stories. Just listen, just ask. It's a heck of a lot easier. Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction, but 9 times out of 10, that's just not the case, and it doesn't apply to you. And the stories you make up, the lies you tell yourselves, the drama you create is going to be far worse than the reality of most situations. So it's always going to be better to just listen and not make things up.
Yeah, there's some stuff about kind of resetting yourself, like what are the facts? And another example from that book I mentioned earlier is a wife comes home and finds like a ticket stub or a receipt in her husband's coat pocket, and thinks to herself like, I'll just ask him about it. And then sits around and says, ooh, maybe he went to dinner with somebody else. Maybe he went to a movie with somebody else. And, days or weeks go by, and at this point, she's lost her mind. The world's, her whole world's burning down around her. And finally just lets it all out, gets in an argument, talks about, hey, I found this in your pocket. And the husband's like, oh, we should probably call and figure out what that is. And it turns out it's something they did together. The restaurant and the movie theater or something like that shared a payment processing system. So this woman is having a breakdown, thinking her whole marriage is over and her husband's out cheating on her. And it's really a receipt from when they went out to dinner together. And that's just that conversation from the beginning would have eliminated weeks or months of stress and anxiety and that big blow up at the end.
Yeah, that was a pretty classic example of how quickly things can escalate when being right is kind of more important than finding the truth there, or when the desire to communicate is lost over finding ways to kind of really push that agenda, especially when it's one you don't want to believe in. I don't think she wanted to believe that her marriage was over, but yet it was so confirmed in her head based on those stories she told herself, based on those holes she was filling in from that fixed mindset, like Trevor mentioned, that she was certain it was right and didn't want to be wrong. I think it all goes back to that communication is a two-way street, that old tired cliche. If you go into it, however, just wanting to be heard or to be right, you've already started off heading the wrong direction. But if you go into it, being open and receptive to the other perspective, even a perspective you may not want to hear, but you're at least open to receive it, and also with the desire to clearly represent your thoughts and reasoning behind them and kind of engage in that mutual interaction, you just stand a much better chance of arriving at a destination that all parties can agree on and benefit from. One of the major downfalls of arguing to win over communicating to reach a resolution is that even if you get your way, you may not come close to getting what it is you truly want.
And that's probably more prevalent now than ever with Facebook and those awesome threads that are 10 miles long of people arguing. Nobody really wins an argument. And it's important to understand. You can come to a solution, or you can win an argument and piss everybody off. But even in that case, you don't really win. You never change anybody's mind or move anybody towards a more effective solution. If you keep telling yourself that nobody will understand, right? Like, they should just read my mind, they won't understand me, blah, 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 and you refuse to communicate with people, then that will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And their lack of, whether it be your family, your friends, your business partners, if you can't figure out this communication component, their lack of understanding, other people's lack of understanding as well as your own, and the stories you tell yourselves are going to get wilder and wilder, and they're going to create more and more friction on your path to trying to get better every day.
I think it's all we got, but thanks for listening. And, when it comes to communication, just remember, it's easy to think you know what you may think you know, and that others happen to know what you know, but you don't actually know what you think you know until you actually know that you know it, and vice versa. You've
been listening to the Relentless Podcast. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to keep getting a little bit better every day, do us a favor, head over to iTunes, subscribe, leave us an honest review, and be sure not to miss the next one.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.